Sadie and Vivian, Yasher Koach. You chanted Torah and Haftorah so beautifully, and Yasher Koach for offering those commentaries on this week's Torah portion. As we've said now, Parashat Vaeira, and as you taught us, is the second of 4 Torah readings that depict what we know as the Passover story, a narrative at the core of both our Jewish self-concept and our ethical commitments to all human beings. The teachings that each of you offered rose to the occasion of this famous and important parsha, and were not only rooted deep in our ancient wisdom, but feel uniquely appropriate for this moment in the life of our country. This week, as we begin to grapple with what a new administration in the White House might portend, there is a palpable sense of fear all around us. Fear of what will come next and of the future of our democracy. Fear for ourselves, perhaps, and certainly for others. Fear for undocumented immigrants under threat of deportation. Fear for transgender people whose identities this administration denies. And the list goes on and on and on. But you reminded us, Vivian, of the promise of moving past our fears. Through the examples of Moses and your personal experiences, you emphasized that faith in yourself and others is one way to move beyond fear and grow towards something better. In your teaching too, Sadie, you demonstrated that sometimes the things that are scariest to us might be wake-up calls, or perhaps invitations to act. You reminded us to take seriously the issues of our time as opposed to pretending as if everything is just business as usual. I'll come back to the wisdom that each of you shared in a moment, but let me just say at the outset that this week of all weeks, your Torah is precisely what so many of us needed to hear, as is the narrative of the Torah itself. At the end of last week's Parsha, Moses and Aaron confront Pharaoh and demand for the first time that he let the people go. Not only does Pharaoh refuse, but in a move designed to sow doubt among the Israelites, he doubles their workload, crushing their spirits and also their faith in God. That is the backdrop for this week's reading and for each of your teachings, Sadie and Vivian. The whole drama of Pharaoh versus Moses is a competition for the people's faith. As you taught, Sadie, Rashi and other rabbis subsequently view the plagues of this week's portion as necessary to prove to the people once again the presence of a God who they thought had abandoned them. And the parsha opens as Moses has seemingly only made their lack of faith even greater as they suffered the punishment from the first time he went and tried to free them. Parashat Vaeira begins with God's consolation of Moses as he worries about what to do next. But God's tone at first is not so reassuring. It's not the loving embrace of a parental God or even the encouragement you might expect. Instead, God offers a history lesson. I am the eternal, God says in the opening verse. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. I established a covenant with them. I've heard the people's cry and have remembered this covenant. Maybe Moses wondered why God didn't hear it sooner. Because as you point out, Vivian, Moses then asks, even the Israelites didn't believe me the last time I tried this argument. Ve'ech yishma'eni Pharaoh. So why then should Pharaoh listen to me? God doesn't answer him directly. Instead, almost as if God didn't hear the question, God continues offering a lecture about the Israelite past, listing in 12 verses the names of Israel's tribal heads, descended from the original family that went down to Egypt. The kinds of verses that one typically ignores or skips over, since it's just one long list of names: Levi, Gershon, Kohat, Merari, and so on. You'd be forgiven if you ignored this apparent non sequitur. But Rashbam, a medieval sage, points out the wisdom inherent in it. By naming these generations, Jacob to Levi to Kohat to Amram to Aaron and Moses, Rashbam teaches that God is reminding Moses of where he comes from. It's not just that Moses is descended from a people who had a relationship to God, but that his ancestors endured enormous trials. God's reply seems to say, don't forget that you're a link in a chain that has encountered good times and bad. It's not really an answer to Moses' initial question about what to do, but it is possibly a much more important lesson. Moses has to remember that his ancestors have survived through hundreds of years of suffering in Egypt. They might seem defeated in the moment, but they are resilient and strong and worthy of their freedom. If that was true for our mythic forebears, it was all the more so for our more recent ancestors in Jewish history, who encountered everything the world could possibly present, both good and bad, over the last 3,000 years. Ours is a story of resilience, of holding on to truth and hope, of retaining our values throughout the darkest episodes in human history, playing the long game and believing that redemption is always possible. Looking around at us today, it's so easy to not really feel that, to become distressed and focus on how unprecedented everything feels. Increasingly destructive natural disasters, the rise of authoritarianism, and a steadily more volatile world order, the further disintegration of democratic norms and institutions. We know this. We see it happening, and it is terrifying. I wish I could say, as Rabbi Nachman did, that the most important thing is lo lefached klal, to not have any fear. But fear may be unavoidable for us. Instead, I might paraphrase your teaching, Vivian, and say that the most important thing is to not be guided by fear, but to push ourselves to believe that something better is still possible, even if it feels far away. In moments like this one, it may be a comfort to remember that our tradition tells a tale of people who were hardy in the face of fear. As you taught us, Sadie, that the people found in the plagues not just the power of God, but the inspiration to believe that they can act to help themselves. If our story follows an arc of degradation into freedom, it's because the people pushed themselves to believe in the possibility of that freedom and insisted that they could enact it. The Israelites suffered in Egypt for 400 years. And as we read in this parsha, they were almost broken. Almost. Their spirits crushed from cruel bondage. But in all that time, the sages say, they held on to their dignity and sense of self. Ramban says that even if their spirits were crushed, in all that time, they didn't lose faith that one day the people would reach their freedom. Another midrash says that in all that time, the people retained their unique names, clothes, and language. And our sages use this to teach that in all that time, the people held on to who they were, drawing from the lessons of their ancestors and the values that they knew to be true. As we draw from the example of Jews who came before, we too can hold on to eternal values that they bequeathed to us and which no one can take away. That we must love the stranger because we were strangers in the land of Egypt, that we must not oppress a worker who's poor and needy, that we must pursue justice, appointing judges who deliberate with righteousness, that we were placed on the earth to work it and protect it, that all people are created in the image of God. These Torah verses are so well known that they feel cliche, and that actually might be a good thing, because they should be repeated again and again. By holding on to these values, the Israelites not only survived through the rest of the Torah, but a generation later built a society with this notion of justice at its core. And despite the time they spend in the narrows of Egypt, despite 4 years of wandering thereafter, eventually they come to build it. Friends, we are entering an uncertain time. It has felt that way for a while, but especially right now. And as we decide how we want to react, or resist, or simply live in this world, we don't have one foolproof answer to the question of what to do next. But as God replies to Moses, when he wants to know how he can behave in the face of an enormous challenge, in the absence of a clear-cut answer, we do well to remember just how long our history has been, how resilient our people has been, drawing strength from their strength, and above all, never losing sight of the core values that we know to be true, which sustain us, and which will one day, we believe, pervade all across the world. Shabbat Shalom.